Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So good to be with you this morning on the 2nd of April, which means we are on the final month of the quarter. So if you're tired of listening to Steve on Wednesday night, you're almost there. And me, of course. But so far we have used really 2/3 of the class to look at the Exodus and Mount Sinai and the period of the Exodus. So we've really used 2/3 of the class. So in this final month, we're going to kind of be transitioning from that to the wandering in the wilderness. And today is really one of the pivotal points in Israelite history, really, as we look at them finally leaving Sinai and them heading up to Kadesh Barnea, where we should enter the land, is really what should happen. Of course, we know that's not going to happen. We're going to be in Numbers chapter 10. Numbers 10. Is there a PowerPoint? Oh, okay, I see. It's here. I don't see it there. I'm kind of waiting around. Okay, I'm just over here clicking. It's back there. It's blank. That's why. Just kind of staring there. Okay, Numbers 10 through Numbers 14. That's where we are today, and it's really where we're going to be the entire time. We're not going to be flying through a ton of chapters, but there's still quite a bit to look at during this. So here we are. We're at Mount Sinai, and in Numbers 10, verse 11, we're told that on the second month, on the 20th day of the second year, the cloud lifts, and they know it is time to leave Mount Sinai. So they are going to leave, and this time they're going to leave the first time as God's people. They've been God's people, but they didn't have the covenant. They weren't in that covenant relationship that they got at Mount Sinai. And so they finally leave Mount Sinai, and they are God's people, and God is their God. So they finally leave, and they're going to leave in an orderly way. They're going to, we kind of get this numbering of like, all right, here's the leaders of each group, and we have really, I guess the way I'm going to put it is, it's kind of a staggered way of going. Judah is going to lead the way. Judah will leave. And because, I guess when I originally thought of this, I think about them packing up. Everyone packs up and we all just take off, right? But it's 600,000 men plus women and children. And so it would be quite difficult to just pack up everyone all at once and head out. And so they stagger it in a way that is going to be orderly. So we have the section. Do you remember that we had 4 sections around the tabernacle? And that they had leaders of each group, like, for instance, Judah, I think with Issachar and Zebulun. We have Ephraim has some as another section. Dan had another. And so they're going to take off with Judah first, and then the Gershonites and the Merarites are going to start packing up the tabernacle, and that they would take off as well. They would go on, and then we'd have another section come through. I believe it's Reuben's camp, and they would start leaving as well, followed by the Kohathites, who had the sacred items of the tabernacle, and behind them you have Ephraim and the camp of Dan. And so that's how they're going to leave Mount Sinai. So today, we're going to be looking, and I'll zoom up. We have another slide here in a second with a larger map, but we're going to be looking at Taberah and Kidroth Hattaavah, and Hazeroth, I think, is the other place that we're going to be looking at, that we're going to have complaining before we get all the way up to Kadesh Barnea. So in Numbers 10, in verse 29, we have the story of Moses speaking to his brother-in-law. It says that Moses said to Hobab, the son of Reuel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, "We are setting out to the place which the Lord said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we will do good, and and we will do you good, for the Lord has promised good concerning Israel. And so Hobab, who is his brother-in-law, it is Jethro's son, is Zipporah's brother, has been with them living there in the land, which makes sense, right? Because they're around Mount Sinai in the land of Midian area, and which is where Moses was when he sees the burning bush. So it's all in kind of the same area, right? And so he's been living with them. He sees them, and he says, "Why don't you come with us?" Basically, he says, "You come with us. God's promised this land. Just come with us." And he first says, "No. I'm going to go back to my people and live with them." But there's evidence later on, I think in Judges 1 and in 4, and maybe in 1 Samuel as well, that his descendants are in the land. So I think we can conclude that he ends up going with them and helping them. Moses' kind of appeal is, hey, you know the land pretty well. You can tell us where is good to camp and where we might not want to camp, things like that. You know the landscape. You'd have a better idea and give good advice on this. And it could be that he stayed there, and maybe in the 40 years of wandering that he ends up joining back with them and moving into the land. But either way, his descendants end up in the land of Canaan. And so as we close the chapter of chapter 10, the ark is going to go before Israel to find rest. It's going to be out in front of them. So here we are. Here's the map. There's the Mediterranean Sea here. We have the land of Egypt. We're in the Sinai Peninsula. And here you can kind of see different alternate routes that they might have gone, but we're just going to assume that it's somewhere in here. And you see we have question marks beside all of these places that we're going to be looking at today. Until you get up towards Kadesh Barnea, and that is a more well-known we're kind of more sure of that place there. But as they're headed up, they're going to be heading up to the south tip of the land of Israel, of Canaan, of the promised land. That's where we're going to be headed today. Here's another map to kind of give you an idea of the route that they might have taken. And then it's kind of going to show you maybe some of the wandering in the wilderness, if I could speak correctly, and then them on up later on as well. So let's go ahead and get into Numbers chapter 11. In Numbers 11, we have kind of the story of the people complaining. And that's kind of going to be a theme for the next couple of chapters as they go through this. It says in verse 1, it says, "Now the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and fire of the Lord burned against them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. The people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out." And so they're going to call this place Taberah, which means burning. And so they are complaining, and on the outskirts of the camp, fire comes from heaven. It might be more like lightning or fire, something like that, comes to the outskirts of the camp, and it kills some of the people. And they cry out. Of course, Moses intercedes for them, and we have that stopping. So that's our first complaining. Now let's look in verse 4. It says, "The rabble who were among them had greedy desires, and also the sons of Israel wept again and said, 'Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we used to eat free in Egypt, and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. And now our appetite is gone. There is nothing at all to look at except this manna.'" You know, when I read that, I kind of get it. It's the rabble, the mixed multitude. We've already seen them once before. But I kind of get maybe why they're complaining a little bit. It's been a year, and they've had manna. They don't really have meat. And they have gone, apparently, in Egypt, even though they were slaves, right? They were eating pretty well off. It says the cucumbers, and I like cucumbers. I really do. And there's a difference between the ones you see in the store and the ones that you get that are homegrown, right? There is a big difference. And I'm looking forward to that here in a couple months when we finally get them. I mean, we're right up against planting season, right? And before long, we're going to have cucumbers. And having that fresh cucumber, compared to the ones you get at Walmart or whatever, there's no comparison. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about, and some are like, either way, it's a cucumber, right? So, but I kind of can see how this happened. And I think this happens sometimes in our life too, when in kind of a different way, is maybe someone complains about something and you kind of start thinking about that and think, they're right. I wish I had whatever it was. I should have that. I think that happens pretty often. And I know that this by far was not first world, but I think a lot of our problems that we complain about today, we kind of say sometimes, well, it's a first world problem. We complain about the ice cream machine at McDonald's being out or whatever it is, right? And you think about that and you get so frustrated that you've gone all the way across town to go get a McFlurry and it's out. And you're like, seriously? And that happens. I know that's a silly example, but we complain about stuff that if we lived elsewhere, like our brothers and sisters in Africa or somewhere else, we wouldn't care about that. We would just be thankful for what we have. And that's kind of the whole concept here, right? Is they got greedy, they start hearing this thing about, oh yeah, I do wish that we had meat. We haven't had meat in a year or so, I guess a little less than that. We haven't had this meat. It's just so frustrating. And they complain. And so here, Moses he's overwhelmed. Look in verse, let's pick up in verse 11. It said, Moses said to the Lord, why have you been so hard on your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight? And you have laid the burden of the people on me. Was it I who conceived all the people? Was it I who brought them forth, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom, as a nurse carries a nursing infant to the land which you swore to their fathers? And you skip down, and I think it's in verse 15, he says, so if you're going to deal with me in this way, please kill me at once if I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my wretchedness. So he's overwhelmed. It's too much for Moses to do anymore. He's seen this complaining, and he's just overwhelmed, I think is really what's going on here. And so we're going to see here God is going to take care of both of the issues. He's going to take care of the meat, and he's also going to help Moses out. So God sees this issue, and in verse 16, the Lord says, the Lord therefore said to Moses, gather for me 70 men from the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and their officers, and bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand there with you. And he explains that he is going to bring his spirit that is on Moses, and he's going to put it on them as well, and they're going to be able to help him to alleviate some of the stress that is on Moses, and they're going to be able to officiate and help out in ruling and things like that. So that's the first way he's going to fix this. And notice he doesn't complain, or God doesn't say, what are you talking about? He understands that the stress that he's under, and he alleviates that problem. The second one he's going to do is he is going to bring meat. Let's look here in verse 19. He says, you shall eat not 1 day, not 2 days, not 5 days, not 10 days, not 20 days, but a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, Why did the people ever leave Egypt? Okay, so he's saying here, I'm going to make it so much that you're going to be sick of it. You're going to be completely sick of the meat. But Moses here questions it and says, verse 21 says, the people among who I am are 600,000 on foot. Yet you have said, I will give them meat so that they may eat for a whole month. Should flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to be sufficient? Or should all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to be sufficient for them? Look in verse 23 what the Lord says. So Moses is questioning, how is this even possible? We have over 600,000 people, and you're going to say we're going to have meat for a month? We're in the wilderness. We're in the desert. Look at verse 23. It says, the Lord said to Moses, is the Lord's power limited? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. This kind of reminds Moses, who do you think I am? I'm the Lord. I am God. And my power is not limited. And he should have known that. Of course, I think in maybe the state of mind that he was in there, being down and stuff, perhaps that had something to do with his attitude. So as we go on, we have these elders in verses 24 through 30 are given his spirit, is given God's spirit on them. And there's two others that are outside the camp, or outside the tent of meeting. They were supposed to go to the tent of meeting. And they get the spirit as well. And Joshua kind of says, hey, shouldn't we stop them? And Moses says, no, he's basically happy for the extra help. And so it's going to be 72 men that are going to help Moses out with helping some of this, alleviating his stress, I guess is the way you could put that. We also have the story here in verse 31, and we'll read some of it. In verse 31, we have that, now there went forth a wind from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea, and let them fall beside the camp about a day's journey on this side, on a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, about 2 cubits on the surface of the ground. 2 cubits, I think, was 18 inches is one, so is that 3 feet? Something like that? That's how high this quail was. So there's quail everywhere. And so the people go out in that day. In verse 32 it says, the people spent all day and all night and all of the next day and gathered quail. And he who gathered least gathered 10 homers. And they gathered and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. So we see that it's an unbelievable amount. I think I read that that's over, it's either 5 or 10 gallon, 10 of 55-gallon buckets is how much meat one person had gathered, the least of them. And so they spread it out against the camp, and basically I think they're drying it out, making a jerky, trying to preserve it for a time. And look in verse 33. While the meat was between their teeth, before it was chewed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people. And the Lord struck the people with a very severe plague. So the name of that place was called Kidroth-Hattaavah, because they were buried, the people who had been greedy. For Kidroth-Hattaavah, the people set out for Hazeroth, and there they remained at Hazeroth. Okay? So, why is there, I guess the question is, so what happened? Why is there this plague? It's about greed, right? The children of Israel and this rabble, these people that are with them, have been so greedy. And I think that the issue is that, well, it's greed. And they're not thankful for what has happened here. And they rush in and they're eating it between their teeth. And the vision I have with this, I think about them just, grabbing as much up and cooking it, not even be thankful for it, and they start eating it. And then the Lord says, or he gets so angry about this. Doug?
The Lord was mad to start with because there's other ways they could have got his attention as far
That's a great point, and one I was about to make. So I kind of thought about this. What if, kind of on the flip side of that, looking at when the quail had come, what if the story had went something like, and the people gathered, all day and all night, and they praised God and were thankful for what he had done for them? What would have happened? I don't think there would have been a plague. That's for sure. I think that there would have not been that issue that there is. That there's not that greed. But the issue is the fact that they are greedy. They did not care, that they were just trying to grab as much as possible and did not thank God. They weren't thankful for what God had provided them. And yeah, Doug's right. I think they could have gone about this way differently. They could have gone to Moses. They could have, their attitude could have been way differently in approaching God and saying, hey, we would really like meat to eat. But instead, they are unthankful for what God has provided them. Yeah, you're right. It's a good thought, and it kind of really comes to a head here later on with God ready again to wipe out the people. So we've got Hazareth is where we are as we continue our complaining, really. And Kidroth Hattaavah means the graves of lust, is where those people end up dying. So we move on to Hazareth, and we're going to see bad attitudes again. We're going to see some more complaining. This time it's not from the children of Israel themselves. It's from Aaron and Miriam. In verse 1 of chapter 12, it says, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. So, looking at this, I think it says Ethiopian up there. Miriam and Aaron, I think maybe there's more emphasis on Miriam might have stirred up Aaron. It doesn't quite say that, but perhaps since she's the first one listed. Either way, both of them start complaining about, well, he's married this Cushite woman. I think in the translation, this is really saying that he married a black woman. But I don't think this is a race issue at all. I think it's more of a, he is the leader and he's married someone that's not an Israelite. But the Waldron suggests that this was somebody that was part of that rabble of the mixed multitude that was with them, perhaps. Very likely, I would say. But the issue really is not the fact that he married a Ethiopian or Cushite, however you want to say that. I think the issue here, as we can see, let's just read verse 2. It says, and they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? And the Lord heard it. I think the issue here is that they're jealous, that they use this excuse really of, oh, really, he's marrying this Cushite woman? It's not that's the problem. And some, I think, have made this out to be a race issue. I don't think so at all. And kind of to mentally about this, I think there is a difference. Think about their color of skin probably was darker than ours. Obviously, it wasn't as dark as some because there is a distinction made. But you'd look this up. There's all kinds of articles pointing that, this is this racial thing that's happened here. I don't think so at all. But the issue, the underlying, this is just an excuse to say, we want more of the say here. We are wanting to be in this authority. Is God only speaking to Moses? And I think Steve made this point in one of his classes that Miriam must have had some point, some leadership role within the women. I think back at when they crossed the Red Sea, do you remember that she leads the women in, I think, singing and dancing? She leads the women. I think there might be a couple other times that that is brought up, that she is some type of leader. And so she goes with Aaron, of course, who is the high priest, and starts complaining against Moses. Now, look in verse 4 of chapter 12. It says, "Suddenly the Lord said to Moses and Aaron and to Miriam, 'You three come to the tent of meeting.' So the three of them came out." Oh boy. Think about that. You know, if you're Aaron and Miriam, and the Lord says, "Y'all three come to the tent of meeting," I would be like, oh boy, what have I done? Josh?
Has the feeling of getting called to the principal's office.
Yeah, it has the feeling of being called to the principal's office. That's a good analogy of that. So they do. They come to the tent of meeting, to the tabernacle, and the Lord is going to respond to Aaron and Miriam. And he is going to say, let's pick up in verse 6. He said, "Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all of my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, even openly and not in the dark sayings, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses?" Pretty strict, pretty straightforward on what the Lord has to say about this. He says, he's not just some prophet. I speak to him openly. I have a much closer relationship with Moses than I have with anyone else. And you really dare to speak against him in this way. You know, in Hebrews chapter 3, we kind of see this analogy with Moses and his relationship with God and Israel, and Christ's relationship being similar. Kind of, he says that Christ is greater than Moses in that way. And thinking about it, he really is kind of a Christ-like figure for the children of Israel. He's their deliverer. He's a prophet. He's a mediator, of course. He's going to mediate between the people very often. We've seen that over and over again. We're going to see it again today. Very similar to the way that Jesus is for the church. And we see that God is very unhappy with them questioning Moses in that way. So God is going to punish Miriam. And I think really, well, I guess I'll back up and say the cloud lifts from the tabernacle. And when the cloud lifts, Miriam is covered in leprosy. She's a leper. And so Aaron cries out to Moses and says, please help. We have sinned. Don't let her be this way. And God intercedes, and he prays to God. And Moses intercedes and prays to God. And God says, she needs to stay outside the camp for 7 days. And it doesn't ever say that she is healed, but it's very clear, I think, that she is healed because she stays out of the camp for 7 days. And then after the 7 days are up, she's allowed to re-enter the camp and be with them in that way. And they wait on her for the 7 days in the wilderness, there in the wilderness. And so they're going to move into the wilderness of Paran there in the very end of this story. Yes?
Notice Aaron's confession. They had sinned. Yet with their confession, there were still consequences with their sin. It did not automatically change. God's choice was not to change Miriam back to where she was, but she had to live with this for a certain amount of time. In this case, a week. So the thing that I learned is that when I
That's a great point. Doug says that there's really consequences for this, that she is forgiven of this. She's going to be able to return to the camp, but she still had consequences that were involved. She had to stay out for 7 days. We're going to see that same point made again here in 2 chapters over when we talk about the punishment for the children of Israel. Great thought. So let's continue on, moving into chapter 13. In chapter 13, this is kind of our pinnacle point, if you will, in this lesson, is going to be the 12 spies. This is a story that's very familiar to us, but it's one we can make quite a few good lessons on. So the Lord is going to tell them to get 12 men and enter into the land of Canaan, and they're going to spy it out. In verse 17 it says, Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, and he said to them, go up from there and into the Negev, then into the hill country, see what the land is like, whether the people who live there are strong or weak, whether they are few or many. How is the land in which they live? Is it good or bad? How are the cities which they live in? Are they open camps? Are they fortifications? How is the land? Is it fat and lean or lean? Are there trees in it or not? Make an effort to get some of the fruit of the land. Now the time was the time of the first ripe grapes. So he commands them to go and to spy out the land. Give us a report of everything. Remember, these people, Moses included, they've never been to the land of Canaan. They had never seen this land. They don't know. He asked, is it wooded? Is there trees? How are the cities? Is it open? Is there fortifications? Are they walled cities? We want to know everything. So go in and find out everything about them. And so they're going to really, it says that they will go all the way up to the very top here and all the way down. They're going to spy out everything in this land. And the Waldrons make the point that they probably split up into maybe groups, or at least went out and split up the spying out, because it would have been quite a bit for 12 guys to be walking all the way. Might not have been very conspicuous. Well, I guess it would have been conspicuous when you see all these 12 guys, these foreigners walking through the land. What are you doing here? So they are going to spy out everything, and they do that. And in verse 26, they're going to come back. Well, in verse 25, it says, when they return from spying out the land at the end of 40 days. 40 days they have spied out the land of Canaan. That's how long that they were in the land for. And in verse 24, they had cut down some grapes there, and they bring them back. And they're going to bring them back. I guess I'll back up and it says in verse 23 that they carry them on their shoulders, a pole between them as they walk, as they bring it back to the land. The point is, it's really good. This is really good. These grapes are huge. These are not the regular grapes that they're used to. The point is that the land is good. And you know what's going to happen. It's a sad story, really. The spies are going to come back, and think about, as you as an Israelite, you've been waiting to hear what's going to happen. You're so ready to enter the land, and we start off with a pretty good report. It says in verse 27 of chapter 13, thus they told him and said, we went into the land which you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey. And this is its fruit. And so it's going to, I think I have a picture here. Yeah, as you see them discussing it with Moses, you can kind of see over here the fruit, some of the fruit that they've brought back. Okay, so far so good. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. Everything's great. Verse 28, nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and are very large, And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. So, they basically say, you're right, the land is perfect, it's great, but there's fortifications. The descendants of Anak, which are giants, are living in the land. I think in verse 22, it talks about that Caleb had gone into that land and had gone into Hebron, which is where there was a descendants of giants living there. Interestingly enough, that is the exact area that in Joshua 14 and 15, Caleb comes back and says, hey, I was promised this land and I want it 40 years later. And he goes in to Hebron where there's giants, and he goes and kills the giants, and he takes that for himself. So opposite of what's about to happen here, right? And so they start complaining, and they say that we just can't do this. The people are too great. It's a great land, but we don't have the power. Now in verse 30, it says that then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, we should by all means go up and take possession of it. We will surely overcome it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are too strong for us. And so they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had promised, and the land through which they had gone in spying in and out, a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw were of great size. And so they cry out in this horrible way. In chapter 14, God is ready to destroy them. The people start rebelling, and they say to him, they say, we can't do it. We ought to just get a leader and head back to Egypt. Of all things to do, head back to Egypt. They say, that's what we're going to do. And so God says, you know what? I'm done. I'm done again with these people. I'm going to wipe them out. And we're going to start over with Moses again. Moses, of course, is going to intercede. And God is not going to destroy the people as he wanted to. But there's going to be consequences for this action. And we don't have time to go through it all, but really what is going to happen is they are going to be punished to wander the wilderness for 40 years. Really 39. He's going to include that year at Sinai with this. There's two exceptions to this rule, right, though? Who are the two people? Joshua and Caleb. They are going to survive, and they're going to be able to go into the land of promise. So, as Doug pointed out earlier, there is consequences to their rebellion and their lack of faith. He is going to punish them, and these people, he mentions the 600,000 soldiers are not going to be able to enter the land of Canaan, but the next generation will go into the land, except for Joshua and Caleb. And I will say, God, I think, forgives them. He mentions in here, he's going to forgive them of this and not wipe them out, but there is still a consequence for their action. And maybe that's what we should focus on there, is that there is consequences for sin, but with God's grace, they are still forgiven of that, even though they are not able to enter the land. I know I had to run through that last part. You have any comments? Freddie?
The actions of these people right now is exactly what God knew was going to happen when they first came out of Egypt, and they didn't go up through the land of the Philistines, because they were not people of war, and they're still not.
And they're still not. Yeah, that's a great point. Any others? Okay, thank you, everybody.